Which American president did the Queen tell to go to bed? How did the Prime Minister of the day find himself involved in the whole Megxit saga? And did Tony Blair force the Queen to hold hands while singing Auld Lang Syne? We have an absolutely fascinating episode for you. Hello, I'm Luke Blackwell and welcome to a very special episode of Palace Confidential Author-ised, where we talk to authors and biographers about the fascinating books they've written on the royal family. Today we start with a brilliant guest, Valentine Low. Valentine, you are most welcome.
Thank you.
Now, Valentine's previous book, Courtiers, published in 2022, looked at the relationship between the monarchy and the brave souls who advise them, while his latest book, Power and the Palace, explores the difficult dynamics between the monarchy and the ministers who run his or Her Majesty's governments. As a former royal correspondent for The Times, Valentine was the journalist who broke the story of the bullying allegations against Meghan Markle in 2021, which we will be discussing a little later on in the programme. Now, regular viewers will know what I'm about to say next. Yes, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to the Daily Mail Royals channel. Why? Because that's how you make sure you're up to date with all our exclusive content as soon as it's released. If you want the free Palace Confidential newsletter, meanwhile, to be sent directly to your inbox every Thursday, you can pause the video for a moment, we won't be insulted, and scan the QR code on screen now with your camera phone. And of course, if you're watching it on your phone, you can just head to the description below where we will put a link for you. Right, Valentine, I feel I have to start with this question because I teased it at the top. Who sent the late Queen Elizabeth rubber gloves and why?
That was Margaret Thatcher. Margaret Thatcher was not a countrywoman. So when she went up to Balmoral, as all prime ministers do every September, so it's a rite of passage, annual rite of passage for the prime minister to join the sovereign for a weekend, she was not prepared. First time she went, when she was just a minister, before she was prime minister, she didn't even have the right walking boots, so someone had to lend her a pair of shoes to go walking. But when she was there, the prime minister, one of the things that happens in Balmoral is often they go and have a barbecue in the evening. It's one of the lodges on the estate. And afterwards, the Queen gathers up the dishes and does the washing up. And Margaret Thatcher was appalled that the Queen did the washing up without any rubber gloves on. Queen obviously being of hardy country stock. And so when Thatcher got back to London, she sent a pair of marigolds in the post up to Balmoral for the use of the Queen.
It's worth clarifying for our international viewers, where it's not always clear because our King, previously the Queen, played an important role in political life. They're at the state opening of Parliament. They see every bill, every law before it's signed into law. They sign it into statute, exactly. But they don't have the same power. So if you could briefly tell us a little bit about their role and explain that to viewers.
I mean, first of all, the sovereign appoints the prime minister. Now, they don't choose the prime minister, although, you know, some centuries ago that was the case, but it's gradually changed. But formally and officially, they appoint the prime minister. They are there for the state opening of Parliament, the annual ceremony at the beginning of each parliamentary session, and they will read out a speech. The sovereign reads out a speech, which is actually written by the government. It's the government's policies, the government's views, the government's words. The sovereign is merely reading it out. But of course, that's a subtle relationship, because sometimes Buckingham Palace gets sight of the speech in advance, some days in advance, and sometimes, you know, they can't object to the policy, they can't object to the contents of the speech, but they'll sometimes say, oh, this language is not quite right, maybe we could just adjust this a little bit, and number 10 Downing Street will listen to that. And as we said, you know, the sovereign signs into law, acts of parliament. They also have a regular weekly meeting with the Prime Minister. The weekly audience is on a Wednesday these days. The Prime Minister goes on after Prime Minister's questions. So I think, you know, having been through the mill of Prime Minister's questions in the House of Parliament, they're quite grateful to have a sort of nice one-on-one session. And the point about that one-on-one session is that no one else is in the room. So it's the one time Prime Ministers can completely share everything, because they know that the Queen or the King, whoever it is not going to leak. I think it was Jim Callaghan or possibly another Prime Minister who said, you know, it's the one conversation they have with someone who's not going to leak it and doesn't want their job.
And presumably it must be for some like therapy, for others, a bit of
absolutely.
advice getting.
Yeah, absolutely. Several prime ministers have talked about in terms of therapy. And David Cameron talks to me about how it's a chance to sort of talk things through. And he was prime minister when the Queen had been on the throne for a very long time. So she was able to bring a certain kind of wisdom and expertise to their conversation. She'd been through it all before.
There was a bit of telling the monarch what to do, which you talk about in your book. Winston Churchill, of course, saw the late Queen, as she was, 25 at the time, as something of a child. That relationship was slightly different, wasn't it, to perhaps the other relationships she had with prime ministers subsequently?
Yes, Winston Churchill was this revered figure, this war hero, as it were. The Queen was very young. She'd acceded to the throne before she expected to. She greatly respected and loved Winston Churchill, and he adored her. And yes, there were times when the government basically told her what to do. One was she and Prince Philip were living at the time at Clarence House, which would later be Prince Charles's home and still is the King's home, effectively. And they didn't want to move to Buckingham Palace. Buckingham Palace is an awful place. No one in their right mind would want to live there. It's sort of impersonal and huge and drafty, and it's like a sort of conference centre, practically. Clarence House is lovely and cosy. It's like a rather grand, lovely London home. And they didn't want to move, but the cabinet told them, you've got to move. And the courtiers, interestingly, were on the government side. So the Queen and Philip had no choice. And the other thing was about the name of the royal house. So it was shortly after the Queen acceded to the throne, Lord Mountbatten, Louis Mountbatten, former head of the Navy and so on, who was, of course, Philip's uncle, he was heard boasting that the royal house of Mountbatten now ruled. And this got back to the royal family. And some of the Queen Mother certainly absolutely furious. And basically there was a lot of discussion about it, and it was agreed that it should remain the House of Windsor, which Philip did not like. And the Queen was, certainly unwilling to upset her husband, but she was forced to agree to this, that it should be the House of Windsor that ruled and not the House of Mountbatten.
I want to just touch on a point you just made there, which is very interesting, certainly the Buckingham Palace point, because we're now almost back in that situation. Buckingham Palace is undergoing a £369 million multi-year renovation. The King, we're told, is going to move in. Few believe this in royal circles. Prince William has said that he doesn't want his family to be living there. He sees his family elsewhere. Can you see a government of today trying to force the royal family to live there at Royal HQ? It seems inconceivable, doesn't it?
It does seem tricky, that one. William, it depends who's succeeding to the throne. William is, now middle-aged, let's be honest, and he can be quite stubborn. He knows his views, he knows what he thinks. I mean, he respects the relationship with the government, but I don't see him backing down over that one. If it was if something ghastly happened to William and, say, Prince George, a young Prince George, accedes to the throne, I think maybe a government could persuade him to move into Buckingham Palace. But but it's interesting. Can Buckingham Palace still maintain its aura as the sort of headquarters of the monarchy if we know that the monarch doesn't live there? But I think if sufficient banquets and so on are held there, if investitures are held there, if the officers are there, if the King and Queen wave from the balcony there, I think they can probably get away with it, but it's an interesting change in our national life.
It absolutely will be. I want to get back to this you've mentioned. I mean, it goes through the book, so it will be through our interview, I'm sure, that the fluid nature of the British Constitution. In 1962, then Queen Elizabeth objected to the Prime Minister of the day, Harold Macmillan, wanting to appoint a particular Deputy Prime Minister. Tell us about that bit.
It was not the person who was going to be appointed Deputy Prime Minister. It was the fact of there being an official job of Deputy Prime Minister, which the Queen thought was unconstitutional. She thought it removed her prerogative, because if there's a Deputy Prime Minister and the Prime Minister resigns or dies or is ill or whatever and is no longer in the job, there would be the implication that the deputy steps up, and this would remove the Queen's prerogative, legal right, as it were, to appoint a Prime Minister herself. That's why the objection.
There's also this sort of sense, I think, from your book, that obviously everyone wanted to put opinions onto the late Queen. They always wanted a sense that she thought one way or the other. But her relationship seemed to be guided more by personality than political when it came to her prime ministers. It wasn't necessarily one side or the other she favoured, it was the individual.
I think that's true. I mean, she was once asked, I think by the Shah of Iran, whether she'd had more conservative prime ministers or Labour prime ministers. And she said, do you know what, I don't know. Because she didn't really think of them as whether they were conservative or Labour. She thought about their personality. So some she got on very well with, obviously Churchill, Harold Wilson. I think she got on pretty well with Jim Callaghan too. And there were others she got on less well with. I mean, Edward Heath. It was sticky. He had no small talk, Edward, very stiff. And Thatcher, famously, not the easiest of relationships. So it was definitely about the personal relationship, much more than the politics.
You were talking to, obviously, former prime ministers. Did they still remain very guarded about what actually was said in these meetings? Did you find they were still felt a sort of sense, almost the omerta of what was going on?
I think it slightly varies. John Major is very correct, betrays nothing of what happened. David Cameron has, on occasion, revealed certain things about his prime ministers. Yes, some more,
Yes, they got into trouble for it as well.
Unwittingly than others. But generally speaking, there's quite a strong omerta. Yeah.
You recount how one prime minister fainted not once but twice in front of the Queen.
At least, if not more. Margaret Thatcher, obviously, presumably she suffered from low blood pressure. People do, and occasionally fainted. And there was one occasion, I think it was the annual diplomatic reception at Buckingham Palace, and Thatcher's there, Dennis is with her, Charles Pole, her foreign policy advisor, is with her, and they're in the lineup, and Thatcher keels over. And obviously people like Charles Pole are extremely worried, and Dennis Thatcher looks over and says, "Oh, don't worry about that, she's always doing that."
What was interesting, I think, about Thatcher is that, I think you say this in the book, it's the first time the Queen was encountering a Prime Minister, not only a woman, but also who was the same age as her.
Exactly.
Tell us a little bit about that relationship, because that's a sort of fascinating change to the Queen. So she got on from having these more senior men, grown-up men, to having a woman her own age. That must have been quite a change.
Yes, I mean, the point about their relationship is, in a way, that the least important part of it was the fact that Thatcher was a woman. I don't think that in the Queen's reckoning and how the Queen related to her, the fact that Thatcher was a woman really played a big part. I think Thatcher had a huge respect for the royal family, but she was always slightly awkward in the royal presence. She didn't have that natural ease that, say, Harold Wilson had, or perhaps Jim Callaghan. And as we've discussed, at Balmoral, she wasn't a countrywoman. She wasn't happy in the Highlands, sort of tramping across the Highlands or going deer stalking, God forbid.
And the class system really was more profound and wide then, was it not?
Yes, wasn't her thing at all. More important was their political differences. One was the Commonwealth. Margaret Thatcher had very little time for the Commonwealth, whereas the Queen absolutely loved it, thought it was incredibly important. And that was a great point of difference with them. And there were various sort of these Commonwealth summits where the British government, the Thatcher government, was regarded with great distaste by the rest of the Commonwealth because of the issues of South Africa. So the apartheid regime was in place in South Africa, and lots of people wanted sanctions against South Africa, and Thatcher refused to impose sanctions. She thought they didn't work. She thought they hit hardest the ordinary sort of working people of South Africa, but it made the government in international terms very unpopular, and the Queen did do her best to kind of broker that, and she, it was a sort of awkward time politically in terms of their relationship. But there were other things. I think the miners' strike. So during the miners' strike of the mid-1980s, Margaret Thatcher thought the British government had to stand firm against the miners' union, whereas the Queen was very concerned about the effect it had on ordinary people, on communities and so on. I think that caused an awkward tension between them.
One area of contention, shall we say, was when it came to Prince Andrew and the Falklands War. Tell us a little bit about that story and what the Queen's view was and what Margaret Thatcher was at that time.
At the time of the Falklands War, Andrew was a helicopter pilot serving with the Royal Navy, and there was a discussion about whether Andrew should go to the Falklands, because there'd be no keeping you behind the front line. If you're a helicopter pilot down there in the South Atlantic, you're on the front line. And Margaret Thatcher was, I think reluctant that he should go, but the Queen was absolutely adamant. And interestingly, if you remember your Falklands history, the Foreign Secretary Lord Carrington resigned at the beginning of the Falklands because Britain had failed to foresee this invasion. And his number two, Richard Luce, later Lord Luce, resigned with him. But the very last thing they did before resigning was discuss whether Prince Andrew should be allowed to go to the Falklands. And they discussed it, and they recommended to Margaret Thatcher that he should be allowed to go, and then they resigned.
It's a very tricky thing, but I mean, it came up later as course of the Queen and talking about, her grandsons taking her shilling. They should be, therefore, be sent off. I want to get back to Tony Blair now, though, because that was obviously seen. We've had portrayals of it in The Crown and various other films set around that time. Certainly all the sort of interest into the late Princess of Wales, Diana's life. Tell us about that relationship. Does he deserve the credit he has for handling the Diana aftermath? Has the Queen been maligned, her role there? What are your thoughts on that period?
It's pretty complicated. The first thing you should say is Tony Blair desperately wanted to get it right. I mean, it's an interesting little, hardly an anecdote, but insight that when he went to Buckingham Palace, having won the election, he goes to be appointed Prime Minister, and he goes up to see the Queen, she appoints the Prime Minister, he comes down again, and he's very worried about saying the wrong thing. So he checks with officials, can I say I had a nice conversation with the Queen? What can I say on the doorstep of Downing Street? And they say it's fine. You can say you had a nice chat with the Queen, but it's symptomatic of. In a funny way, Blair's quite old-fashioned. He did believe in the importance of the royal family and he wanted to get it right. And then there's that moment, the morning after her death. Tony Blair's in his constituency, and he does a statement to the television cameras about the tragic death of Diana, and he calls her the People's Princess. And it's a very Tony Blair-like phrase, isn't it? And it just captures the moment, and I think that was awkward for the royal family, and it symbolises what would be weeks, months, years of awkwardness for the royal family. And the handling of the week between her death and her funeral, the narrative has built up that basically New Labour saved the day for them, they told them what to do. There's an element of truth in that. The palace asked for their help. On the Sundays, that is the day she died, the palace did say to Blair, listen, could some of your people come over? So Alistair Campbell went over to the palace, others went with him, a small, so they definitely gave valuable input. And there were things that happened, the Queen remaining up at Balmoral, and so on and so forth. The issue of the flag, whether there should be a flag at half-mast over Buckingham Palace. But you also have to give credit to the royal family, because they also recognised who Diana was, and they recognised the seriousness of how her death should be marked. And I think a lot of what happened at the funeral came from the palace, so that wasn't just the Blair government telling them what to do, it was also the palace. It was, and I think there's a certain amount of resentment in the palace that this story has built up. But it's also true that they did help them, they did help guide them, and it was all got quite difficult in the middle of the week, and Tony Blair definitely thought the Queen should come round to London. He thought she should speak. But he felt he didn't know the Queen well enough. He didn't have that relationship. He couldn't really tell her, but he knew Charles better. So he spoke to Charles on the phone, and they had a conversation, and Charles agreed with everything that Blair said. So it's not Blair telling Charles what to do. They were in agreement. And then Charles spoke to the Queen, and then we know the rest. She did come down to London. It kind of saved the situation, really, and she walked with a crowd. The crowd was extremely sympathetic, and then she gave that address on television, and there was a compromise about the flag issue. So, you know.
Briefly, I wanted just to ask you about some, shall we say, awkward footage of 1999, the Millennium Dome as it was then, celebrating the New Year, and the Queen and Tony Blair holding hands to sing Auld Lang Syne. Tell us a bit about this.
It's one of the most excruciating pictures of the royal family there are. The look on the Queen's face and the awkwardness on Blair's face. But the thing about that is that it was in the programme. Everyone knew that Auld Lang Syne was going to be sung at the end of the evening. But it got to the moment, and Blair thought to himself, oh God, what do I do now? And he's dealing with this quandary when it's actually the Queen who raises her hands. So the myth is built up that, as it were, Tony Blair grabbed the Queen's hand. No, the Queen realised there should be some hand-holding going on. She promised her hand, but the curious awkwardness about it is, everyone else crosses hands for Auld Lang Syne, but for some reason the Queen didn't. So she's holding her hands out straight, so Blair held her hand. But when Blair got home that night, end of the long and disastrous evening, it was disastrous because so many of the VIPs were held up at security, I think it was, I can't remember, people, so all these important people, like newspaper editors, had to queue for ages to get in. They were all absolutely furious. They all thought the whole thing was a disaster. So at the end of this long and difficult night, Tony and Cherie are getting into bed, and Cherie said, well, I thought that was marvellous. It was such a lovely evening. Blair says, all I can say, darling, is I'm very glad these millennia only come round once every 1,000 years.
Well, it sounds like the Queen saved the day in a way, took charge of the occasion. Moving on to another world leader who she had to take charge of, did the Queen really tell President Obama to go to bed?
No, she didn't. She got someone else to. So it's a banquet at Buckingham Palace. From memory, I think it was Obama's state visit, and so they've had the banquet. They're in the whatever room it is afterwards, having drinks, having a lovely time, but it's getting late. And the Queen thinks the evening should draw to a peaceful close, and so she summons George Osborne, who's the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and tells him that he should tell Obama that it's time. Please, would you tell President Obama that it's time for bed? And Obama obviously says yes, ma'am, or whatever. Yeah. And Obama's sort of standing there somewhere, surrounded by a gaggle of people, obviously having a lovely time. And I meant to go and tell him to go to bed. And then fortunately, the Queen's private secretary, Sir Christopher Geidt, as he then was, he said, don't worry, Chancellor, we have it in hand.
Another great story. Now, I want to talk, you might be able to dispel a few myths here. Queen backs Brexit. That's what the Sun was claiming in 2016. Yes, they claimed that she was behind us leaving Europe. But
the Sun claimed that in 2016. That was based on a lunch at Windsor Castle a few years earlier. And the Queen had spoken apparently with venom and feeling about the EU. And I can't remember what her actual quote was, but the implication was that she was against Europe, and on the basis of that, the Sun had a headline, Queen backs Brexit. Now, interestingly, the Sun got in trouble with the press regulator because they ruled that the headline was not justified by the words in the article. So nothing the Queen said actually said that she backed Brexit. Anyway, I learned that during the months of the referendum campaign, the Queen spoke to a minister, and she said to him, or her, whoever it was, "I don't think we should leave the EU. Better the devil you know." This got back to David Cameron, who then had to decide whether to use it in their campaign, because clearly the Leave camp had no qualms about using the Queen, hence the Sun's front page. But Cameron thought it was not right, I think probably correctly thought it was not right to betray a private conversation with the Queen and a minister. But it's quite clear that the Queen was a reluctant Remainer. And if she'd had a vote, which she doesn't, but if she'd had a vote, she would have voted Remain.
You reveal an extraordinary story, Valentine, about something that happened to a then young Camilla Parker Bowles, now Queen Camilla. Tell us a little about this.
Yes, so this comes when Boris Johnson is invited for tea at Clarence House, where he's Mayor of London. He's already been and had a meeting with Charles a few weeks earlier. Not sure that went terribly well, not badly, but not terribly well either. And then Camilla apparently says, "Oh, he looks like fun, can we have him to tea?" So Boris comes over to tea with his press guy, Keto Harry. The previous time they'd gone by tube and they'd been late. Slight disaster. So this time they cycle over and they're just parking their bikes in the bike shed. When Camilla comes down, she said, "Well, they told me you'd cycled, I didn't believe them." Anyway, she grabs Boris, says, "You, me, upstairs." Keto Harry goes off to have tea with the private secretary. Boris comes down an hour later, absolutely full of joy, absolutely thinks Camilla's fantastic. They also get on terribly well. She tells him something extraordinary. Boris Johnson at the time was trying to set up some centres in London. I can't remember if they were rape crisis centres or sexual emergency, centres across the capital to do with assaults on women and helping them so on. And they get talking about that. And Camilla tells him that when she was a teenager, she was on a train going to London, and some chap basically starts molesting her, groping her, I think. And Boris says to her, "Well, what did you do?" And Camilla says, "Well, I did what my mother taught me. I took off my shoe and I whacked him in the nuts with a heel." And what some people believe, and I know Boris's press guy believes this, that that was the root of Camilla's interest in campaigning against sexual violence against women. I don't believe that. I think that sort of kind of trivializes it. I think it's a much more deep-seated and well thought through campaign of Queen Camilla's. But it was an upsetting incident, and it happened too often. That sort of thing happened too often then, and happens too often now. I don't think it scarred Camilla for life. I don't think she's haunted by it. But what's splendid is the robust way she dealt with it. We can only admire.
Absolutely, another admirable tale about Queen Camilla. To Megxit now. What was the political implication of that, and what would that have involved when it came to working between the royal family and the government?
Well, politically, it was an interesting example of which they're dotted throughout history of the royal family turning to the government to help them in times of personal family crisis. It happened in Victoria's time. She got Palmerston to try and talk to her son, the future Edward VII, who was leading a pretty rackety life at the time. It happened when Ramsay MacDonald was Prime Minister. George V tried to get him to stop the then Prince of Wales, future Edward VIII, who abdicated, to stop riding in point-to-points, because it was rather dangerous. Ramsay MacDonald had a go, but fell on deaf ears. Yeah. So there are these instances of with the royal family in desperation because they can't solve some personal family crisis of turning to their prime minister or another minister perhaps. And when Megxit happened, allegedly, according to Boris Johnson, he was asked by someone, he doesn't say who, but asked by someone to try and intervene with Harry and Meghan to stop them going. And he's at some event which Harry is at, and they go off into a side room and have a private chat for about 20 minutes. We know they do because this was recorded at the time, the fact they had a private chat. Of course, at the time, we didn't know what the chat was about. Obviously, Boris's words had no effect whatsoever, and we can't be surprised by that because it seems like a pretty perfunctory effort and pretty pointless, and Harry and Meghan were set in their ways. But interesting example of the interplay between the royal family and the political sphere.
Sticking in these slightly controversial waters, as it were, 2021, as I mentioned earlier, you broke the story of the bullying allegations that had come from staffers within the palace who were working for Meghan Markle, which she's always denied. We were promised an investigation. We've never seen the results of those. What do you think the effect of that incident and that story that you broke has been?
Well, if you go to the investigation for a start, that was an unwise move by the palace to say there was going to be an investigation, because one knew straight from the off that it was never going to be made public, the results. And also, I think it was very limited in its remit. I think it was all about how the kind of palace functions in terms of how you deal with complaints. It was not about, was Meghan a bully? Did Meghan bully her staff? So even if the results of the investigation had been made public, I think people might have regarded them as disappointing, because I don't think it would have addressed the core issue that most people are interested in. The effects of that, it just means that people look at Meghan and indeed Harry, because I think Harry was slightly implicated in the bullying allegations as well. They look at them with a different view. The important thing about the whole Meghan saga, which I strongly believe, is that it could have been handled better. They were clearly unhappy. They'd been clearly unhappy for a long time. And I think the palace machinery, the senior elements, as it were, of the palace machinery failed to recognise this early on and failed to do anything about it. And by the time Harry and Meghan said, we want to be off, we want to do something different, by the time that happened, it was all far too late. It had all become too acrimonious. And one only hopes that the palace has learned its lesson since then. In the same way that they learned their lesson about Diana. I think they didn't welcome Diana in quite the way they should have done. They tried, but they pretty cack-handed about it. And I think we saw that they made a much greater effort with Meghan when she came along to welcome her into the warm embrace of the royal family and try and accommodate her and try and react to her needs. But, there's always new lessons to learn.
And how they handle staff as well, because obviously a lot of staff left very unhappy about this whole instance and the interaction with the royal family there and their courtiers. So presumably they had lessons to learn about those people and how they
presumably, and one hopes so. Yes.
Yeah. We mentioned Harry there, and we've had recent problems with Prince Andrew, and it does feel sometimes that the whole constitution, the whole sort of edifice on which our royal family and the government coexist is built on goodwill and the fact that you hope the person in that position will do the right thing. But then a couple of these people come along who are, some would argue, unsuited, characteristically to being in the royal family or having this sort of position. Do you feel there are enough checks and balances that were we to have a Harry or an Andrew character come along as first in line to the throne, that they'd be able to coexist in the system as it is?
I think it's a very good question. I think the system evolves gradually in a very unwritten way. And what's interesting is that, I think we've been pretty lucky. The monarchs we've had over the last century or so have all been pretty dutiful. Some of them might have had, as were character flaws, some of them might have been a bit dim even, but they've done their best and they've believed in service. And the one who might have been a disaster as king, possibly Edward VIII, didn't stay on the throne. So you could say that the country dodged a bullet there. We'll have to see. I mean, the one advantage of the system we have, and it's a pretty funny old system when you wouldn't create it from scratch, is that the people are brought up with a sense of service. They're brought up knowing what their destiny is. You know, they take it in with their mother's milk. So, you know, however William turns out, he has had service drummed into him from an early age. So you hope he'll behave well, behave properly. It can go wrong. But they're only there on sufferance. And one of the themes that I can address in the book is they're there on sufferance and they exist in the way that they do because politicians allow it. And it's not just because politicians are slavish royalists. Some of them are, many of them are more neutral, but they kind of think the system works, and more importantly, they think the country believes in it. The moment the country stops believing it, the politicians are no longer going to defend the royal family and support the system. So it's all based on trust and seeing that we have a system that works. As soon as people no longer believe that, you're in trouble.
It is such a complicated, nebulous idea, the British Constitution.
Yes.
You know, again, for foreign viewers, it's unwritten. A lot of stuff that's codified in other countries or very clearly set out isn't. Did you feel after you gained a greater sense of it from writing this book? Did you gain a sense of maybe ways we could be doing things better?
What I got from the book was this fabulous sense of how we make it up as we go along. I mean, there's a great historian, Peter Hennessy, Lord Hennessy, who knows more about the Constitution and government than anyone else alive practically. He once bumped into a constitutional expert in the corridors of Westminster, and this chap said to Peter, I've been thinking about the Constitution, and I've come to the conclusion that the Constitution is what happens. And it is very much what happens.
Absolutely fascinating. Now, this actually does lead us quite nicely to my final question of the day, and it's certainly one for those interested in conversations between the sovereign and the Prime Minister of the day, and also those who are interested in a British Constitution. Is the British Prime Minister really forbidden from asking the monarch a question if the answer might be no?
That's a constitutional nicety I don't really feel qualified to answer, but I think surely not.
It has been just great talking to you, Valentine. Thank you so much for coming on. For our viewers and listeners at home, we will put a link to Valentine's brilliant new book, Power and the Palace, in our description below. You can pre-order it there. It's absolutely worth it. Really, really fascinating if you're interested in all things royal and British political too. A reminder too that you can sign up to the free Royal newsletter by going to the on-screen link or by using your phone camera to scan the QR code that you'll find on screen now. A reminder that's also going to be in the description below if you're watching this on a phone. And if you love Palace Confidential, of course you do, then you'll love that newsletter. Thank you again to my very special guest, Valentine Low, and we'll see you soon. Goodbye.